Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Level Up webinar. I am Michaela, joined by Marissa, and we are very excited to be continuing this series today, talking about all things hybrid work. If you're new to this series, we host one webinar per month designed around a different topic each time for business leaders to strategically level up their business game. And of course, we'll be talking about building tech into your normal business operations, but to shake things up a little, we'll also bring in guest speakers who are experts on the topics and have an interview with them, get some insight to help level up your business game even more. And before we get started today, I do want to mention a couple of quick tools and then we'll kick it off. So these are pre-recorded conversations. However, we are here live with you in the chat box. So please feel free to ask any questions throughout so that we can address things you really want to hear about. And feel free to ask them whenever you think of them, even if they're not necessarily relevant to the content we're on at that moment. We are more than happy to answer them whenever. And one last thing before we get going, this webinar will be available as a recording after the fact. So you'll get a link via email with the recording that you're absolutely welcome to share with other people inside your office or your network that you think would benefit from the content. So today we're going to be focusing on the topic of the hybrid workplace. And we're in a time where hybrid work can really be considered the new normal, as more and more businesses continue to adopt this hybrid environment. And today we'll chat about a couple of different topics when it comes to leveling up your hybrid environment. We'll talk about the physical office space and making it fit your organization's needs and the technology to help support those office spaces. We'll also chat about enhancing the employee experience, best tips for cybersecurity, and how to level up your asynchronous communication. So there's a lot in store for today. So with all of that being said, let's get started.
Let's level up.
So to kick things off in our conversation about the hybrid environment, we're talking about office spaces and really making these physical spaces fit your organization's needs and helping your team be as productive as comfortable as possible as we continue to adopt hybrid work. So we are joined by Michelle from PMC Commercial Interiors, who has so graciously offered to share her expertise and knowledge about this topic. So Michelle, before we start talking about office spaces, though, if you would like to introduce yourself and give us a little insight into what you do at PMC.
Sure. So I am the Director of Ideation at PMC. Basically what that means is I have a design background, but I've really become very passionate about understanding human behavior and actually how space can really make people perform better. So I use kind of an elevated level of design and research and data analytics and leverage that information to help create spaces where people ultimately want to be or ultimately want to work, live, heal, any of that.
All the things.
All that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to hear your expertise in the field. I was actually reading an interview with Microsoft's CEO not too long ago, and they were talking about how they're redesigning their office space, and they were mentioning all these new technological advances to support the hybrid environment with people working from all different places, but they made it clear that they are not going to abandon the physical office space because technology simply just cannot make, connection less dependent on that in-person and direct contact collaboration. So with that being said, how can we use our office spaces to support flexible work?
Well, we are human beings. We crave that social interaction, right? So we need the office space to provide that for us. So there's only so far you can do on these Zoom calls. You can do some, some of the tactical work and some of the meetings, but it's not until you're in face that you really start to bring that culture alive and keep that culture thriving. So the office space certainly needs to support those places where people can come together and have that human interaction. So whether that's just having more social spaces, more places for people just to bump into each other, as well as having the conference spaces too. And with those conference spaces, meeting spaces, you need to make sure that with a flexible work model, you're always going to need to support a remote audience. Sure, there's always going to be someone probably working from home, and it used to be like that in the case, but I think now more than ever, it's just going to prevail a lot more.
Right. It's not like that one or two person that's working remotely.
Yeah.
It's now like more people consistently
Sure.
interacting with each other across
Yeah.
those spaces.
Yeah, and I think technology, you also have to make sure that when you have these meetings, you got to make sure that everybody feels engaged, everything's very equal. You need to be able to present your information in a way that whether you're in person or you're virtual, can participate and really feel a part of that. So yeah, it's interesting. And I would also say not only is for flexible work, we hone so much in on this idea of collaboration and bringing people together. But people are still going to go to the office to have their focus work too. You can't just say, oh, okay, well, like people, they can do all their emails and their heads down work at home and they come to the office to meet. That's not always going to be the case. So there still needs to be that balance of having individual space and the shared spaces.
That's a really good point, because when I think about office space and a hybrid work environment, I think I tend to focus more on like what's new about what we're going to look forward to when we, be in the office more. And so I'm thinking like human interaction.
Yeah.
Speaking of human interaction, what are some examples of work? And you mentioned a couple, but what are some examples of workspaces that you see that really do help with that connection that we're craving so much of?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, people need to have this allure. They need to be drawn into these spaces. So if you think about that, what are people drawn to? Food and drink is one thing. So having like a really great cafe space where people can get a great cup of coffee, free snacks. People love things that are free too. So
Yes.
Checking all the boxes.
Exactly. And I think other spaces, whether it's lounges or just a different experience, you want to refresh your body and your mind. So you want just a completely different experience. So anything along the lines of lounges and game rooms, and even taking it as far as respite areas, meditation, yoga, places like that where you can duck in. And then the other really huge one is outdoor spaces. So people are obviously very scared about the germs and stuff. So what's better than being outside where you can have the fresh air? And so there's been a huge uptick with that and designing the outdoor spaces to make them really effective, almost an extension of your real estate.
And effective use of space makes me think of when everyone decided to move from, I say everyone, I'm just painting with a broad brush here, but when people moved from cubes, rows and rows of cubes, to this idea of open floor plans. And I have had my own experiences with open floor plans. And so I'm curious for your professional advice on whether or not open floor spaces are effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do believe that open floor plans are still effective, but there's smart ways of doing it. So really, if you think about taking more of an activity-based planning strategy, meaning if you are going to have zones or neighborhoods that are really dedicated more for that heads down focus. So whether that neighborhood does have some higher panels, they have some sound masking, not only the physical, but also the kind of the psychological aspects need to be thought about. So those new behaviors and norms. So when you're in this area, you're not going to be loud on a conference call. You're going to duck into a focus room that's adjacent to the space and do it there. So it's understanding that there still needs to be some changes in behaviors. So quiet zones versus a neighborhood or a place where it's just much more active, and that people will go there because they are doing a different type of work and they are going to get inspired by having activity around them. So it's just it's a lot about the planning, and it's a lot about the norms and the behaviors, and also thinking some of the tools and technologies, so the sound masking, some of the higher panels, other acoustical treatments, just how you treat the floors and the ceilings are going to help with some of that, help with keeping people from being distracted.
And you said about the private spaces, we can't forget that people want to come to the office and still have that focused time. So if people had moved to an open office space before, and it's not in their budget to completely redesign the space, are there solutions out there that make it easy for them to provide that the more secluded space? I guess, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, for the easiest thing is there's been a ton of introductions of those phone booths. You probably have seen like literally they almost look like a phone booth from London that you plop in there. But they've come a long way, and there are very easy ways to put those spaces in. And I think converting just some of your other kind of enclosed spaces to, again, help with, whether it's having the video calls, especially, I think that's one of the biggest things I think there being an issue when you're in open plan is think about all the video calls we are now doing. You can't just do that out in the open in your workspace, having people behind you. That's a big distraction. So finding those areas and if anything, you're going to spend money, it's making sure you have those spaces where people can duck in and do some of that focus work.
And you mentioned something about acoustics.
Mm-hmm.
And my own open floor plan experience, it really revolves around acoustics, especially I come from a really large family who loves hard floors and refuses to purchase rugs.
Right.
So it's a very personal thing to me. Loud noises are very difficult. Can you talk a little bit more about what people can do for that?
Yeah, sure. The more hard surfaces you have, obviously there's going to be a lot of reverberation, a lot of echo. So there's kind of three main things that you can think about with acoustics. One is the ceiling treatment. So a prevalent trend is open ceiling. You've probably all seen that. It looks great, but it's not the most acoustic because sound will just bounce around up there. So having a ceiling tile, which I know isn't beautiful, but they actually have come a long way. They can be a lot nicer. That having a really high what we call NRC rating is one of the best things you can do to help with trapping some of that sound. Also the flooring, taking into consideration the flooring, having something that will absorb. So if you have concrete floors or wood floors, it does make sense to sprinkle in some of those softer surfaces with area rugs or whatnot. And then the other thing is masking. So we talked about absorbing, covering, and then masking would be sound masking. And so that's a really, really easy, and it's become a lot more affordable to have that kind of white noise that sounds almost like your HVAC humming throughout all the spaces. And that again, really kind of starts to deaden some of that echo and reverberation and help people concentrate a little bit better.
And sound is like a trigger for me. If it's super loud and I'm trying to focus, it doesn't match my headspace. It can be really draining on me. And so I know that it's a focus of productivity, but also with the hybrid workplace, we're talking a lot more about prioritizing that employee experience.
Right.
Acoustics could be a thing. You talked about people that drawing spaces that lure people in. What are other things that you're seeing people need when we talk about well-being? Mm-hmm. You already mentioned yoga rooms, meditative spaces.
Yeah.
Obvious. Those are things, but what else could people look for?
Yeah, I mean, well-being is really satisfying the physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So physically, things just having really great ergonomics. Your task chair, for one thing, like sometimes companies skimp on the task chair, but you're sitting almost 80% of your day. So to have a really great task chair and having that ergonomics, the sit to stand again is very prevalent too. Having a desk that can raise and lower, and not only is it, people say, well, I never raise my desk, so why do I even need that? I never raise my desk, but I lower mine because I like to have it at a right height versus not everybody wants to have it at the 29.5 inches. That's just not comfortable to them. So having a height adjustable desk, you can put it exactly where you want, especially if you're really short or really tall, whatever. So ergonomics, even computer monitor arms, things like that. And then other, just having that variety of spaces, again, for people to reset their mind, just to not stare at their screen, the same surroundings. But those alternative workspaces need to also support being able to work. So having still the right laptop tables or having a place to plug in your computer, things like that. And then, again, like the respite areas or the yoga rooms and things like that. Not everybody can have those spaces, but maybe it's access to the outdoors or encouraging people to go take a walk. It's again, can go back to kind of some of these new norms and standards or things you want to adopt as a company to embrace this idea that you need to take care of yourself and your whole being.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And of course, free food always helps, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Healthy free food is always a good thing. After hearing all this information for business leaders that are interested in leveling up their office space and continuing this conversation, what are next steps that they can take?
Sure. I mean, I think it's really kind of business leaders. They really are the ones that are going to start to shape what's going to happen coming down the road. So some companies, I believe, have started to make these initiatives to bring people back to the office. But honestly, they're going to stumble along the way. This is a huge experimentation for everybody. So it's just know that you're probably going to start to do things and you are probably going to need to adjust it down the road. But as PMC, and what we do is help customers begin that journey, really think through that journey, start to do more of a discovery process, understand what their business drivers are. And by doing that, we do a lot of data collection through surveys, data analytics, things like that, sensor technology. And then we start to help create the spaces that support that data and what their goals and visions are. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. I think we're going to see a lot of changes happening, and hopefully it changes for the good.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And we will share your information so that folks can reach out to PMC to get that conversation started.
Great. Awesome.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much.
We have people moving from working at home to working in the office and then maybe even back again, hence the hybrid workplace. So your technology is a key part of creating a seamless environment for your team to be as productive as possible, no matter where they're working from. And we've been talking a lot about what your team needs in the hybrid workplace so that as we make that return to the office, they're prepared and have what they need. So as we're making the return, what are some of the things that your team will need?
Sure. So, in a world of remote work, we, for the last year and a half, 2 years, we talked about a lot. How do we be successful at home? And like you said, Michaela, people are returning to the office and traveling back and forth. So things are going to look a little bit different. And it really comes down to what's your game plan in the office? Are you going to continue to have assigned seating in which everybody just kind of picks up their desk and travels between from home to the office? And that would be kind of a lot of people who are doing the office-centric hybrid model would be in favor of something like this, where they have a private space dedicated to work at. They would have docking stations for their laptops so that you could connect and go back home and easily connect to peripherals, having a kind of a workstation set up ready for them at their desk. But if you think about more of like an open flow office space or something that is a little bit more that you might experience in a remote centric or maybe like a really hybrid focused place where you're going to be doing a lot more collaboration, or you're going to be renting desks when you need a space, a dedicated space of your own when you're in the office, really kind of this flexible office space. The technology that fuels that's going to look a little bit different. And one thing, if you're sharing spaces, think about people like the protocol for having wireless keyboards and mice that people can bring and keep with themselves rather than share kind of communal accessories of that nature. Also, what makes those office spaces? Do you need a computer with a TV screen? Do you need to be able to have monitors that people can plug into or project from across the room, depending on the size of the space? So those are the things you're going to need to consider based on how you're going to use that office space.
So you talked a lot about like the workstation, kind of the setup of your office space as your employees make the return. But what about the actual computers? When it comes to like your actual computers, are there any considerations that we should be thinking about as our computers make that trek back and forth with us as well?
Well, anytime you take a computer back and forth regularly, you need to think about the mobility of it. A lot of people like lighter, slimmer. It's just easier to travel with. And then also, as you're traveling, longer battery life is helpful. We're talking about laptops here when we're traveling. We're obviously not like carrying our desktops back and forth. In that sense, if you have a desktop at home, then you'd want to make sure that you have desktops or machines available at the office. So again, taking into consideration the type of setup you already have existing. And then, but also thinking about the construction of the laptop. Some of the hard drives, like a solid state drive, is built to withstand a little bit more kind of going back and forth. And so the hardware of the computer itself is pretty important to make sure that when it gets banged up, that it doesn't break, and that having the right warranty on those computers. So accidental damage protection. One, I have a kindergartner at home, so I always am aware that milk spilling on a laptop is a real thing. So having accidental damage protection is good for me. Cracked screens also covered under accidental damage protection warranties. So those are all kind of important things to think about for computers that aren't staying put.
Right. And talking about computers going back and forth and some people being at home, some people being in the office, how can hoteling software play into this and help your team be more productive, again, no matter where they're working from?
Well, hoteling is the idea that you can move between spaces. You can rent them. You go to a hotel and you borrow the room for the night. Kind of the same concept. So you can use conference rooms, desks, even hardware. You can kind of put in place this renting system, and that software helps coordinate all of the things. So if you're not in the office and you don't know what's happening, it gives you visibility into what's available for you to use and to secure those things, and just make that, again, that experience very seamless. One thing that I just thought about that we didn't talk about with computers, that I'd like to circle back to, is that when you're back in the office, wireless is really important, because if your space is designed to allow for people to collaborate and to maybe not necessarily sit at one particular desk, having solid, secure wireless is really important, but then also remembering that in places like having a dedicated desk, you're probably going to want to wire in.
Right. Over the last, year or so, I would say, we've talked a lot about what makes it successful when you're working remotely. The tools that support that remote work were already in place, and we implemented them into our system relatively easily. But now we're moving into a space that requires innovation and will be unique and custom to fit you and your team's needs in your organization. So as people are moving back and forth between the office and home, there are definitely some things that we can help our team do to work well together when some people are there and some people aren't.
Very much so. Cloud productivity, communication, and collaboration tools are really important. Those tools have allowed for us to continue this conversation and working together when we're not physically together. So the continued use of those is going to help us, small businesses, be successful. And one of the things along with that communication is adopting some more asynchronous communication habits. And we'll talk, we have a segment about that. And those tools can cover such a wide range of needs, whether, we're talking about like digital whiteboards that you can collaborate and brainstorm together, all the way to real-time document collaboration to video conferencing. The key with those platforms is to look for things that simplify the experience for your employees, so that you can find what you need and you can create more easily. And platforms like Microsoft 365 help simplify that.
All right, so surprise, we're going to talk a little bit about IT security. It's definitely something you've heard us talk about before, but it's obviously a super important topic, especially in the hybrid workplace. You know, threats are always on the rise and they're always getting smarter. And now that your team is splitting their time between working in the office and working from home or wherever else they may be working, it's incredibly important to think about cybersecurity in your organization and make sure that you and your team are staying protected. So, Marissa, give us your top tips for keeping your cybersecurity game strong while working in the hybrid workplace.
Absolutely. Tip 1, people. Make sure the people who are logging into your systems are the right people and that they have access to only what they need. Because using cloud and the internet is great for flexibility. It means that all you need is an internet connection in order to log into your systems. But passwords are not the safest way to control access to our systems. Sometimes passwords get into the wrong hands. And if passwords get into the wrong hands, and they also have an internet connection, they now can log into your systems. So making sure that you have strong authentication and mechanisms in place like multi-factor authentication to actually confirm the identity of the folks accessing your tools. Tip 2. I had to make sure we were talking about tips. Tip 2. So if we're protecting the identity of our people, we should also protect the computers. And in this particular tip, we're talking about endpoint security. So traditionally, we have antivirus on computers because we want to make sure we filter out the things that get on our computer that we know are bad. So like known viruses. Except that with the rate at which cyber threats are evolving, and the more frequently that people are out of the office and away from being protected by the firewall, those are traditional network security measures, the threats are becoming more sophisticated and unable to be detected by traditional antivirus. And so these are more advanced antivirus products that actually take into account behavioral things. So if it looks like a virus, it's probably a virus, and let's go ahead and make sure that we take care of those things so we can mitigate our risk. We can protect against things from infecting our computers. Tip 3. On the realm of talking about securing devices, let's talk about the things that we know to be true, like security patches. Those are really key. Make sure you're regularly installing software updates to protect against known vulnerabilities. Software sometimes has holes in it, and we're aware of those holes. If we're aware of those holes, the threat actors, the bad guys, are probably aware of those too. And so making sure that you're patching the holes, you're fixing them so you don't accidentally let the bad guys in is a really great preventative measure. So doing that across all of your computers, doing it with your software, your browsers, all of those things. Don't use unsupported software and end-of-life computers. And then tip 4, my last and final tip, is just generally a shift in the way we think about cybersecurity for small business and going away from only a preventative approach where we think we're going to prevent 100% of attacks and moving into a more proactive sense of knowing we're going to have bad things happen inside of our environment. Let's make sure we're catching the signs of it early so we can stop and reduce the amount of risk and prepare ourselves in the event of something bad happening. And I encourage business leaders to think about threat hunting and being proactive in detecting and responding to anything that actually gets past our security system. So it's like the security system for the monitoring for your security system. I was going to say the security system for your security system, but that doesn't make sense.
Right. Sounds right.
Generally, the idea is to have more oversight of your cybersecurity measures, what's working, what's not working, and then making sure you can respond, that you have the technology and the people to respond to potential security incidents. And then if you want to know about cyber insurance and ways to have an incident response plan, we have tons of educational material about how those things can help you come back.
For sure. For sure. And you can never have too much cybersecurity. And, making sure that your cybersecurity plan, whether it be the proactive efforts or the incident response efforts, as the threats get larger and smarter, making sure that your plan gets larger and smarter than the threats. So in the hybrid workplace, with the flexibility on when and where your team is working, we are naturally already participating in more asynchronous communication. We're delivering messages and seeking information to move work forward and collaborate without everyone being present at the same moment in the same place. And it definitely is a shift to being in person and having that quick and efficient conversation where you expect kind of a steady communication flow and you'll reach a conclusion, in the moment. However, there are many advantages to the flexibility that asynchronous communication brings.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've said it. We just naturally have started to do this because our schedules and our presence aren't on the same as everyone else's. So we have this kind of increased productivity and efficiency that you get from being able to communicate in a way that allows you to ask questions and seek information on a delayed schedule that makes sense for the other person. There's also the idea that it alleviates the stress and the tension of having to sit down at the moment and produce on someone else's schedule. You can give some more thought into it. It leads to workplace happiness. So it is a good thing for us to adopt more into our organization, the idea of being able to communicate and not expect an immediate response. The problem is a lot of us feel compelled to respond quickly. It's just the nature of when you worked in an office and you could tap someone on the shoulder and say, hey, could you help me real quick? That was an efficient way of communicating. But when we feel compelled to respond quickly to something that someone might message and not expect an instant response, it can lead to more stress and the the digital burnout or the workload burnout. And it also, if you're paying attention to your teams and you see chats and alerts popping up all the time, it's disruptive. A study was done and it showed that on average, 23 minutes and 15 seconds it takes for us to get back on track once we're interrupted. So if you're seeing those alerts and you're just paying attention for a few minutes, think about all the 23 minutes and 15 seconds you're taking to get back on task. It's
a whole workday.
It's a lot. Right. And for someone like me who interrupts themselves, talk about never getting anything done. And so maintaining a pace that is more healthy in this digital world of communication, it's really important for us to set boundaries.
Yeah, for sure. And can you elaborate a little bit more on kind of what those boundaries look like and, how do you do that in the hybrid office?
I kind of set you up for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Setting boundaries in the workplace, you can do that with the technology. Surprise, we're talking about the tech again. And Microsoft 365 has a lot of different places that you can do this. And so the first place I will start, after my Microsoft 365 plug, is that we need to lead by example with these, with boundaries, with making sure that we are leveraging technology to simplify communication to us as business leaders, doing so, setting the example in how we expect communication to be received and in what channels. So some of the things that we can do: scheduled emails. If you're working outside of something that appears to be normal business hours, you can schedule those to be able to be received at a better time. You can Outlook is actually smart enough to give you prompts. It can give you prompts to say things like, oh, Michaela's actually out of office right now, so maybe you want to schedule this for when she gets back. So you relieve that pressure of someone feeling like they may need to respond during the workday when they're not working, but you don't have to take the ownership of responding maybe a week from now. Which goes to the point that managing your calendars is really important. Putting in, making sure that you have your status set appropriately to when you're busy, when you're out of office, scheduling focus time where you are not being disrupted, and also just managing the notifications across. We have a really great cheat code about managing notifications in Teams so that you're not totally disrupted all the time. Recommend you check it out and share it with your team. And so then you've created this calendar and you're scheduling emails. So when you're delivering those messages, expectations are incredibly important because without them, we set expectations on the receiving end. You set whatever expectation you think. And so if it's not something that you need urgently, letting the person know, I expect, get me this information in 3 days from now, or later this afternoon when you have a chance, let me know. Or maybe it's, hey, pick up the phone and call me now because I need something that's quite urgent. So making sure that we're being always having that communication of what's needed and when. And then also just making sure your team is being mindful. Have the education around what tools to use. Do we use instant message versus email versus a phone or video call? Is it information sharing? Do I expect a response? Is this team communication that everybody should be involved in? Deciding whether it's email versus Microsoft Teams for kind of that back and forth communication. And then also scheduling calls in advance unless something is urgent. So that synchronous communication when you need that real-time feedback to be able to draw to a conclusion in that moment, like you said, Michaela, scheduling those ahead of time gives people a chance to prepare and use the time most meaningfully. And then also, speaking of being mindful, when you go to message somebody in Microsoft Teams, encourage them to check the status of the person. If they're out of the office or if they're away or appearing busy, double check the way you're communicating and if you're setting realistic expectations or if you're expecting someone to respond when they aren't. It'd be like walking over to someone's desk and them not being there, leaving a sticky note and then walking away. So using that kind of filter when you're having communication is important.
Right. So there's a lot of advantages to the asynchronous communication that we're already partaking in due to the hybrid workplace, but there are definitely some considerations to think about as you move through it. We've been talking about the hybrid workplace and all the things that help to support that type of environment as really it becomes the new normal for many businesses. One thing we haven't really talked about yet, though, is our people and how do we create that culture that people crave while splitting our time in different locations. So we brought in Dawn, the expert here at WorkSmart, to help us answer some of these questions today. But before we get started, Dawn, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us some insight into your background and what you do here at WorkSmart.
Yeah, well, hello, Internet land. I'm super excited to be back on WorkSmart Live. I missed all of you, and you haven't seen my face in a while because I shifted completely out of marketing and into employee experience, which is kind of really where my passion lies. A little bit of background about me. My whole career thus far has been about events, whether that's client events with you all, or weddings, or internal events with our staff. And throughout that whole time, I've also had this side business / purpose, passion kind of thing. In psychology, my husband and I had this this group where we would practice authentic relating, which is like a relational skills development kind of community. And so shifting into employee experience kind of has allowed me to bring some of that passion around psychology and how we relate as people and how we form connections and make friendships and find meaning in life into the workplace even more, which is really exciting.
And so important.
So important. So important.
Especially in today's environment that we're talking about. I was actually reading an article last week how it was talking about how both introverts and extroverts can flourish in this sort of hybrid environment. Some people are recharged by being more isolated and kind of in their own space, whereas others prefer that to be in person, in an office working with other people. So it really is the best of both worlds. And business leaders are continuously looking for ways to extend their culture, beyond the physical office building to create that sense of belonging, have everyone feel connected, whether you're working face to face or, working at home or wherever else you may be working from. So Dawn, could you give us, what kind of contributes to the employee experience and what happens if we aren't prioritizing it?
Yeah. So really simply, what contributes to the employee experience is pretty much every aspect of the workplace. It's employee experiences. What does it feel like? How does it function for a person to be in your workplace? What's their experience like? So pretty much everything that they touch, whether it's their devices or communications with their managers or the friendships that they have or how they get to work, it's pretty much everything. So when you're talking about employee experience, it's definitely a very wide lens. But as far as like what's important, I think it kind of comes back to like the really simple question of like, what is important to you in life? Life isn't any different within the workplace than it is outside of the workplace. So if we're talking about how to build friendships and relationships, all we really need to do is ask ourselves, what is important to us in friendships and relationships, and how do we build those? And then how can we leverage that in the workplace? Or what's really important to us in communications with our friends and family and loved ones? Okay, cool, great. Now, how do we leverage that in the workplace? How are we already leveraging that in the workplace? And then what do we need to shore up? So that's sort of the frame of reference that I would start with around employee experience. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it definitely does. It definitely does. And, there's all sorts of different, I feel like, moving pieces that go into it. And, what are the downsides to, let's say, they're not being prioritized and they're not being put in place? What can happen within the workplace?
Yeah, that was the second half of your question. Thank you for...
All good. We turned it around. All good.
Thank you for very subtly like, oh yeah, this is what you forgot to... Yeah. It's been a little while since I've done one of these webinars, so thank you for your patience.
All right. We got to warm you back up.
It's a little rusty, but it's cool. I get there. So what happens if you have poor employee experience? Well, again, going back to life, what happens if something in life feels bad? If you don't want to connect with it, if you kind of just feel like you don't want to get up and engage with it every day, well, chances are you're unhappy, you're less creative, you're less productive, you're maybe a little bit miserable. So if employee experience isn't prioritized, that leaves a lot of room for a lot of different things to happen. You're probably going to have some people who are like super just okay with everything and happy with things as they are, and they feel great and they're wonderful and they're going to stay there forever. But then you're going to have people who kind of get lost on the outskirts and maybe even in the middle too, who are like, ugh, this doesn't feel good. I don't really want to be here. And then slowly creativity decreases. Slowly productivity decreases. And then they leave and they go find other places that give them opportunity to feel good and be creative and have meaningful connections.
It can also be, it can also expand past that one person, right? It can be kind of contagious if like a disengaged employee puts others at risk as well.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Obviously, those are things that business leaders are trying to avoid, especially as more and more businesses adopt, the hybrid environment. So with all of that being said, how do we start, building that flexible hybrid culture and creating that sense of community, particularly in the workplace?
Yeah, I think that's like the $1 million question that everyone's really chewing on right now. So thanks for the easy ones, right now.
No problem. No simple answers here, Dawn.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a little bit before we hopped on this call. And to me, like the simplest way to kind of go about this is like looking at Um, everybody knows what the PPT is, right? People, process, and technology, right? We use that here in WorkSmart. It's called the Golden Triangle. It's from like the 60s. Everybody knows what that is. And I think once we start talking about any sort of like big changes in the workplace, that's a really easy thing to kind of come back to as like your touchstone and guiding light. And now when we're talking about change, we need to think about, I think about it in my head as the two I's on PPT, and the two I's are intention and invitation. So we need our people and our processes and technologies to be like set up in a way that serves this really flexible hybrid work experience. And then we need to be really intentional about when we want to leverage the office and when we want to leverage the remote environment. So LinkedIn is just filled with comments from people about, why do we have to go back to the workplace? Nobody wants to go to the office anymore. They're only taking jobs that are like completely remote. But there are pros to like some amount of being in person, right? I was actually just in the office last week picking up a bunch of stuff, and I saw Kim, one of our amazing people on our leadership team, and we had been kind of going back and forth about some stuff via email. It just wasn't working, and we were like, let's just meet in the office, because she had her whiteboard and she was like trying to draw things out, and we're like just talking via Teams and email and not really getting as far as we needed to. But if we just took the time to come into the office and have that conversation, we'd be done really fast. So we have to think about when is the right time to leverage and just rely on technology. And then what are the pros of coming together and then being really intentional about going back into the office and taking advantage of that when it's right. And then the second I is invitation. So invitation is not just like sending an email like, let's go into the office or let's meet into this Teams, right? Invitation in this context is more of a cultural thing. Are we inviting people into the energy of collaboration? Are we welcoming people into conversation with each other? Are we encouraging collaboration and feedback and constructive criticism still? And you have to be a lot more intentional about that in the remote workplace and also the hybrid workplace.
Yeah, you say that, and I think about our, we follow the EOS model, the entrepreneur operating system at WorkSmart. And in the beginning of our structured meetings, we always check in with each other. And that reminds me of like inviting each other to participate in the meeting. First thing, we're all talking. We're talking about things that are really easy to talk about and relatable kind of in a group. And that gets me at least energized around the idea of participating in the meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Seems rather intentional.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there are definitely some intentional little like nuggets within EOS around personal connections, for sure. And that like personal professional best at the beginning of every meeting is very much designed and intended to remind us all that we are humans. Just like this 10-second little blip of, oh yeah, my life exists outside of these walls. And oh yeah, yours does too. And then it create a little bit more of a relationship between those people because of that.
Definitely. And obviously, as we've been talking about this whole time, business leaders are always looking for ways to support those personal connections and reminding us that we are humans, and whether we're in the office or outside of the office. And there's these principles called authentic relating principles that can help your team stay connected and motivated. Dawn, could you tell us a little bit more about those and how they can kind of contribute to this overall employee experience?
Yeah, sure. So authentic relating is the whole other aspect of my life that I'm really grateful to get to kind of bring into WorkSmart and the workplace in general. And it's based on the idea that we can use relationships as a lens for personal growth and vice versa. We can use self-awareness as a tool for creating more connection with our friends, with our peers, and with our coworkers, right? So it kind of comes down to like a really simple kind of simple process. In the authentic relating world, we call it the holarchy, which is presence, appreciation, integrity, wholeness, and play. And presence and appreciation, I feel like, are really the two places that you can kind of like start with in the workplace. And that are also really the starting point for any sort of connection. And it starts, I call it the now experience. We've done a little bit of this like in exercises with each other within WorkSmart. And it simply means to notice your experience. So that's that presence part. Own your experience. So this is mine and this is yours. And welcome your experience. So again, that kind of invitation of like, all right, we're here. We're welcoming exactly whatever it is, whether it's conflict or ideas or creativity or frustration, whatever it is, we're getting it out onto the table. We're welcoming that. And now we can kind of use like what's real in order to make productive, actionable solutions. And one other thing that I would say is we do going back to EOS, right? Like there's some exercises within EOS that are very simple. You ask this other person a question about their lives and they tell you the answer. And that's really great and wonderful. But the thing that I find really, really, really important if you're going to do those things, they're called personal histories, is that you allow space for connection to happen. And that's a two-way street. Connection is not one person sharing information to another. That's communication. That's awareness. Connection is reciprocal. It's mutual. So if you're going to do those personal histories, great, but allow space for follow-up questions and for sharing a little bit back and forth as well, too.
If we're gonna, if someone's interested in doing more team building exercises around building connection, is there anything that you can recommend from your experience to help facilitate these?
Yeah, I mean, kind of. There are some good things in EOS. Again, that personal histories thing is a really good starting point for teams who don't know each other yet. It's a really good, first little window into someone's world. But again, I would add the addendum of making sure that you add space for feedback and back and forth, because that's not something that actually exists in the exercise. But the internet is just rife with really cool remote team building opportunities nowadays, whether it's stuff on Airbnb. We've done a few things like that are cooking classes or educational experiences. They don't really allow for a lot of back and forth, but it's a really good place to start for sure, because you're creating mutual experiences around shared interests. That's another thing that I would leverage. I would really start to think about how do you make friends outside of the workplace, and then how do you leverage that in the workplace. So one of the ways that we make friends is through shared interests. So if you think about your people, what hobbies exist within your workplace? And can you create some experiences around those particular hobbies? We are an IT company. We have a lot of people who are really interested in games, whether it's video games or board games, both of those things. So we will do board game nights or video game nights, and that allows people to come together and have some fun and create friendships around shared interests.
And there's ways to do that both virtually and in person, because we have to be thoughtful about doing things in person and not excluding remote and all the fun things that come with being in person and remote.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and that you got a lot of good information out of it. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to send them in the chat box now and we will answer them for you. You can also contact either Marissa or myself at our emails listed here on the screen. We're always looking for suggestions and topic ideas that you want to hear about, so please feel free to send us any feedback. Be sure and stay tuned for our cheat code coming out soon as well, which you will be able to watch both on our blog and all of our social media platforms. And we'll also have registration details coming out soon for our next webinar, so stay tuned for that as well. And with that, thank you all again for hanging out with us today, and we will see you next time.